Hey, NFL, hear me out. I just thought of an idea that I think would re energize the excitement in the football season, especially the playoffs. Hear me out. I thought of a playoff or play in format that would reward teams that finish really good in the season from a record standpoint that end up in the fifth, sixth, or seventh seed, while also rewarding the top three or top four teams, depending on how they perform throughout the season. Check me out. So I'm thinking of incorporating 2 or 3 weeks of playoff rounds or play-in rounds, if you will, kind of like the NBA, excuse me. So I'm thinking this would be a format that would allow us to incorporate the current structure and kind of the old structure a little bit. Okay, top 7 teams, right? And let's say we have a situation where the fourth seeded team in each conference barely squeaks in, right? They finish as the number one in their division at 10-7, 9-8, right? Okay. Now, while it's not their fault that they're in a weak division, it takes away from the fifth, sixth, and the seventh seed that finished with a decent record, right? Because depending on the division, that fifth, sixth, or seventh team possibly could have been the number one team in another division. But because they played in a really tough competitive division, they finished where they finished. So I'm thinking, have a playoff setup where that fifth seeded team can usurp the fourth seeded team through a play-in tournament. And the only caveat I can see in this is that the top 2 teams would probably get a few bye weeks. However, as far as this working, okay, have a couple of play-in weeks, right? Have the sixth seeded and the seventh seeded teams play each other. Okay. This also gives them a chance to host a playoff game at home. So the sixth seeded team will host number 7, right? The winner between the 6th and the 7th gets to play the 5th seeded team, while the loser between that game is eliminated altogether. So at this point, it just makes it 6 teams in the playoffs. So that winner of that team gets to play the 5th seeded team for the right to play the 4th seeded team and to become perhaps the new 5th seeded team, depending on the results. So the winner of that game, where the 5th seeded team hosts number 6, that team then gets to play the 4th seeded team for the right to usurp the 4th seed. If that wild card team defeats the 4th seeded team, that wild card team becomes the new 4th seed in the official playoffs. Genius, right? Genius, right? And then that team that was defeated or usurped becomes the new 5th or 6th seed, depending on its record. So if the other wild card team that was defeated between the matchup between the 5th and the 6th seeded game would be a contingent on whether or not that 4th seeded team falls where they fall. Love it. About 2 or 3 weeks of extra playoff games. This rewards high-performing 5th seed, 6th seed, 7th seed teams that finished with a great record, where they possibly would have been the number 1 team in their division if they were in a different division. That rewards them. It gives the number 1 and 2 seed, a couple of weeks of bye, which I think that's maybe the only caveat, if it's one. Hey, NFL, hear me out. Now, naturally, if this is a case where the 4th seeded team, let's say that 4th seeded team finishes 11-6 or 12-5, right? And their record's already good. It's better than the 5th, 6th, and the 7th team. Then proceed as usual. However, again, I'm talking about instances where that 4th seeded team barely squeaked in the playoffs, with a 9-8, 10-7 record, and you got 5, 6, and 7, chomping at the bit at 10-7, 11-6, wondering like, so hey, that's not fair. Hey, that's not fair. That 4th seeded team gets to slide in just because they were in a weak division. It gives those high performing 5th, 6th, 7th teams an opportunity to make some extra noise in the playoffs. Tell me what you think.